This is our class for Acts. I'll go ahead and start and introduce myself. My name is Matthew Thigpen. I'm the preacher for the Fulton Church of Christ. We've been there for the past 8 years. I've been full-time ministry for 20 plus years, or 20 years, a little bit over 20 years now. Like I said, we've been Fulton for the past 8. I've had degrees from Heritage Christian University and Freed-Hardeman University. And I appreciate y'all taking this class and having this time to be with us. We'll go over our syllabus real quick. If you notice, let me fix this real quick. I will go ahead and tell you, I haven't sent the email out yet, but I will get the group. I got that list just a few days ago from Jonathan, and I apologize. The last few days have been a whirlwind for me. So I was unable to send the list out to everybody, but I will get an email out, and I will include the videos, either upload them or I'll put them on YouTube on my personal channel, and I'll send you a link so you can get to those videos so you can go back and watch them if you need them, or if you want to look at them on your own, or if you have to miss class, you won't miss out completely. There will be the videos to help catch you up. We'll talk about our syllabus real quick. The syllabus for this class is fairly simple. What we're going to do is we're going to have a comprehensive study of the book of Acts. As you know, Acts is a pretty long book. 4 weeks to cover Acts is going to be pretty fun. So we're going to have to hitch up our pants and pretty much run with it to get all the way through these 28 chapters. But we're going to look at it as comprehensive as we can. And that being said, we're not going to be able to do detailed on every part of the book of Acts, but there will be certain parts we will focus on more than others. And as far as this is concerned, we're facing, you notice the topic of this class is Acts, the beginning of the church. And so that's going to be our focus, is the idea of the church in the book of Acts and what we can learn from that book and what we can learn about it. As I said, there is no recommended textbook for this class, or is recommended, it's not required. What it is this commentary right here called Truth for Today. There's 2 volumes. I know you tell me you found them on Amazon for $80. If you go to, if you're looking for this book, go to Resource Publications. That's right here. Resource Publications. I forgot the exact email, but if you look up, go to Google, type in Resource Publications. You can order these books from the company itself for $30. It's $30 for volume 1 and $30 for volume 2. And so that may be the cheapest way of getting this book, is to go to Resource Publications. They're the ones who make these. And I'll go ahead and plug this. If you want a commentary for your personal study for any book they made, this red set, The Truth for Today, is one of the best commentaries that I've found. And it's one that every time they come out with a new volume, I try to buy it. And so I recommend it if you need that book. And again, it's not required. You don't have to have it. But if for your personal study you'd like to have it, I encourage you to go to their website. That'd be the cheapest way to get it. What we're going to do is, as far as our grading goes, I'm going to go ahead and tell you I'm not this might be an in-depth technical class of the grading and such. When I took this class in Acts, I remember taking it at Heritage Christian, and when I took it, the professor did the very things we're going to do, and they meant a lot, and they helped me in that class, so that's what we're going to do here. One of the first things you're going to notice, and this is going to be your good honor, is I want you by next class, if you haven't already, to sit down and try to read the book of Acts in one setting. You're looking at about 1.5 hours, 2 hours for the typical reader. I want you to read from Acts 1 to Acts 28 and try to read it. And the other thing about this reading I want you to do 1 or 2 things here. As you read it, try to forget the chapters and verses. And I want you to read it as Luke would have wrote it. When Luke wrote it, it didn't have chapter 1:1 and verse 2, verse 3. It was one continual letter. And so if you sit down and read it in one setting and don't stop when you get into chapter 1 and chapter 2, Just keep reading and you'll understand Acts in a totally new way. Another recommendation I can make for you is that if you've got a Bible translation you have used for all your life, that you've read Acts over and over in it, let me encourage you, get a different translation and read that one. Again, not for sake of trying to compare which one's better, but to see how the different translations word different wording. Because you'll know if you've got one version in your mind, when you read something else, you'll catch the difference. And this is just for you to read, to get an idea of the flow of the book of Acts. And so by next class, we're going to have a little quiz at the start of it that's going to ask you a few little things. We'll talk about the other thing in just a minute. Is that you're going to know or to say, I have read the book of Acts in one sitting. The other thing that's going to be required in this class is something that is helpful to me when I took this class, and I want it to be helpful to y'all, and that is that starting next week, every beginning of the class, I'm going to ask you to give me a point summary of every chapter of Acts. And this is what I mean. I want you to be able to say Acts 1. That's the ascension of Jesus, the choosing of Matthias, the sending out of the Jesus giving his final charge. Acts 2, Sermon on Pentecost, the Holy Spirit, the beginning of the church, whatever point you choose. Acts 3, the healing of the lame man, Peter and John in the temple. Acts 4, Peter and John before the Sanhedrin, Barnabas giving his gift. Acts 5, Ananias and Sapphira, and so on. Acts 6, the choosing of the 7 deacons or 7 servants. Acts 7, Stephen's sermon. Acts 8, Philip and Samaria, and Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. Acts 9, the conversion of Paul. You see what I'm getting at? I want you to have one point. Our goal is to get through Acts 1 to 6 this morning, and that's a pretty big goal because Acts 1 and 2 are hefty to get through. However far we go, next week when we come into class, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a piece of paper, and I want you to put however chapters we get to. If we get through chapter 4, you'll have 4 points. You just tell me one little thing. And the idea is, the goal is that when we finish this class on the last test, you will have 1 through 28. And you're going to give me a point from every chapter in the book of Acts. The reason this is important is, I just went through the first 8 verses. Those points are what I learned back 20 years ago when I took Acts. And that has stuck with me. Where this is helpful, and this is something I encourage you to do with every book you study. Start trying to do this with every Bible book you study. Because I want it to be where if you're talking to somebody and they talk about Cornelius, and they say, well, where's Cornelius? What chapter was Cornelius in? We know he's Acts, but where? I want you, if somebody says, let's talk about Cornelius, you in your mind pop up and say, that's Acts 10. And you know exactly where to go. Now, I know we live in an age that is different, where we've got a phone, we just type it in and it tells us exactly where it is. But if you don't have that resource, I want in your mind, if you hear, say, Jonathan, for those who attend here, you hear him start to say, we're going to talk about Cornelius this morning. Your mind is, okay, we're going to Acts 10. I want you to have a working knowledge of the outline of the book of Acts. And that works into the next thing you're going to do. And that is, I want you to give me I don't know why that went black. I want you to give me a working outline or an original outline of the book of Acts. If you want to do this while you do your sit down and do your reading, that's fine. What I mean by original, I don't want you to copy the book. The book that we gave has the outline. Your Bible will have those headings. Don't copy those. Read the section and see how you divide it up yourself. And again, you don't have to divide it up the way your Bible will. There'll be sections of Acts that you're going to look at, and your Bible may break it up one way, and you say, no, I think it needs to be broke up this way. But I want you to do a working outline of Acts that has every verse mentioned. And what I mean by every verse mentioned is you don't skip. You don't say Acts 1 to 3 is the introduction, and then skip down to verse 13. I want you to have a point that includes every verse of the book of Acts. And I want you to have an outline, and that's going to be due by the end of the class. So that's, again, these are not very hard. They're just things that are going to help you better understand the book of Acts, to better get a grasp. And again, that outline is going to help you with the knowing a point from each chapter. because you're going to know, okay, here's where this is at. Now, the problem with this is going to be, let me go back here to the point of every chapter. Depending on how far we get at the third class, the last class you'll be required to know a point for every point of for every chapter in the book of Acts. The problem is that last class we're going to cover some extra chapters, so you're going to have to know those chapters before you get here. You're going to have a little bit of knowledge. And when I say exams, I'm going to go ahead and tell you I'm not one of these that's going to have in-depth, hard to figure out tests. I just want you to know basic things. Like we're going to talk this morning on the exams, there's going to be questions like, who wrote the book of Acts? And then I may ask you, well, why? How do you know this? And give me just a few little points. I want you to basically show me that you have a working knowledge of the book of Acts. That's more my focus, is that you understand and can know this book. And like I say, it's going to be fairly simple. There's the course, the grading for those who are taking it for credit. I know some are and some aren't. The basic outline is this. Like I said, our goal is to get from the introduction to Acts this morning through Acts 6. And I'll be honest, that's going to be a pretty big task if we get that far, because the first 6 chapters of Acts are very key, they're very important, and they lay the foundation, especially for the first 2 chapters. Next week, our goal is to pick up where we left off and get to chapter 15. Then after that, the third class, we'll get through, go toward 22, and then like I say, the last class will have 6 chapters or so left. So again, there's the memory work's done, and I'll say this, I know the schedule has these, the memory work. This is going to fluctuate depending on how far we go. If we only get to Acts 5, I'm not going to expect you to know something from Acts 6 yet, because we've not covered it. The only time you're required to know something beyond where we studied is going to be this last class. But it is comprehensive. And what I mean by that is, you notice the memory work. Next class, you'll have to know Acts 1 to 6. The next class, if everything goes as according to plan, the third class, you'll have to know a point from Acts 1 to 15. And we do that so make sure you retain. You don't just memorize 6 points and forget them and then learn the next 5 or 6. I want you to know the whole thing. So this is where this is going to pile on. And so the last class will have memory work at the first. And then at the end of the class, we'll have a final exam, and that'll be where we'll talk about from Acts chapter 1 to Acts chapter 28, that you'll have to know a point from each one of them. And like I say, we will talk about this more in depth as we get here and as we go. Again, I don't want you to stress and think there's something hard about this. I just want you to, when you have this class, we finish this class, for you to have a working knowledge of the book of Acts that you didn't have before. And I want you to have a better understanding of it. All right, any question or anything about this? And like I said, I'll email you, I'll get the group email out and I'll include this. And like I said, I'll have the video so you'll have this to go back on. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Let me go back up. If you notice the very top of the syllabus, here's my phone number, here's my email, either one you can get to me. You can call, you can text, email. If you do Facebook, I'm on Facebook. You can contact me anyway, and I'll work with you, and we'll figure this out and work together to make this class and make your knowledge the best we possibly can be. All right, and I'll also include in that email, I'll try to remember to put a link to Resource Publications where you can buy this book and you can find it a little easier than Amazon. All right, anybody got any question or anything before we move into actual talking about Acts? All right, well, let's get into Acts. I will warn you this too. Are we ready? I will warn you this one more thing about me. When I get into teaching mode, I forget everything else. So if we start going over, if y'all need a break, y'all just flag me down and tell me to stop. I'm going to try to remember to stop about every hour and 15 minutes to give us a 5 or 10 minute break to get up and stretch. But if I don't stop, y'all just flag me down and say, hey, it's time for us to take a break. And you're not going to offend me to flag me down if I catch you. But like I say, I am bad about when I get going. I don't want to stop because I love what I do and I love teaching this stuff. And we get in, when I get into it, I get wrapped up in it. So let's start with the book of Acts. We're going to start by asking 5 basic questions about the book of Acts. And I'll go ahead and tell you this too. I don't know if I said it a minute ago. In that email, I will give you this PowerPoint. So you can have this PowerPoint to help you study. And most of the stuff on the exam, I think all of it's going to come from stuff that's on the PowerPoint. There may be a few things that may not be, but the majority of it will be on here are things, there are going to be things we talk about in class. So I want you to have this PowerPoint to study it and look over it and to be reminded of this. Whenever we study, and I don't know how many books of the Bible you've studied in depth or study at this kind of a level where it's maybe a little above a Bible class. Whenever we start a book of the Bible, we need to ask a few questions about it. We need to ask the questions we learned in school of who wrote it, when did they write it, where did they write it from, to whom did they write, and for what purpose. When you start a book, that helps tremendously to know those facts because every author writes different, and every author has a different people they're writing to and how they wrote. We're not going to see it here, but as far as Acts go, Acts is a unique book in the New Testament because Acts is the only book of history in the New Testament. We have the Gospels, the Epistles, the apocalyptic language, but Acts is the only history book that's listed as history. And so Acts stands out that way. Now, the parallel to that is in the Old Testament, you have about 12 books that fall under the category of history. And so when we look at Acts, we look at it different. And I say this to recognize this, in that when you read Acts, you have to know it's a book of history to read it versus how you'd read Psalms. As Psalms, as a book of poetry, a book of wisdom, it is a different style of writing, a different kind of composition than Acts is. And so knowing what kind of book it is and who wrote it and all these questions helps us tremendously as we begin to look and to study in this book and to know about it. Now again, the first basic question we ask about Acts is the question of who wrote it. Acts is one of the books in the New Testament that is sort of different and it may not be. The epistles are different than the Gospels and the others in that the Gospels and Acts doesn't really tell us who wrote it. The epistles typically tell us who wrote it, save Hebrews. They tell us who is the author. You look at the books following Acts. You go to Romans 1:1, 1 Corinthians 1:1, 2 Corinthians 1:1. Galatians doesn't include it, but the other epistles will tell you, the very first verse, it'll say Paul, an apostle. That is the way they wrote books, and that's the way they did letters. You know, I'll make this little point for helping you understand Bible literature. You know, in our world, when somebody writes you a letter, if they write a letter to you, they sign their name at the bottom. In the ancient world, you put the author's name at the top. And to be honest with you, I like the way they did it. Because I don't know about you, but when I get a letter and I see who it's from, the first thing I do is go down here to the bottom and say, okay, who's writing me? And then when I see who's writing me, I know how to interpret the letter. In the ancient world, they started with the author. And then they told who they're writing to, and then they told their information. And so that's why Acts is different, because Acts doesn't give us that information. Instead, Acts begins with an introduction. And we'll talk about that introduction as we progress, because Acts and Luke begin the same way with this introduction, and that's going to lead us into the connection of how we know these two books are connected, and they were written by the same person. Now, the author doesn't identify himself, so how can we know who wrote the book? There are two different sources that we can look at, or two different evidences that we can examine to see who wrote the book of Acts. There is what's called external evidence, and there's internal evidence. The external evidence is these are writers from the early 2nd century, and these are all 2nd century writers that attributed the author of Acts and Luke as Luke. You may not know some of these names, but you may. One is Irenaeus. He was what's called an early church father. If you ever hear that term, church father, a church father is an early ancient writer who was not inspired, but he lived during that early years of the church, but he wrote his own works. Again, he's not inspired, he's not equal with the Bible, but he was a contemporary or shortly after the gospel writers and the New Testament writers. So he's an early source. And one of those is a man by the name of Irenaeus. And Irenaeus lived about 180 AD, so about 150 years after the establishment of the church is when he was writing. So the church is still in its infancy. And he includes in his letter that Luke, or in one of his writings, he mentions that Luke wrote the book of Acts and he wrote the book of Luke. Another one is what's called the Anti-Marcion prologue. There was a false teaching that popped up around 160 to 180 AD that was trying to undermine the Gospels, and his name was Marcion, and there was a writing that contradicted him that proved he was false. And in the argument against Marcion, they had a prologue to the book of Matthew, Mark, and Luke and Acts. And in that prologue of Luke and Acts, he attributes Luke as the author. And so again, you have around the same time, there's what's called the Muratorian canon. If you don't know that word canon, that is not the cannon you shoot. That is a reed, a measurement in Greek. The canon is the list of the books of the Bible. There's an Old Testament canon and a New Testament canon. These are books that should be and should not be included. And what happens is in 170 AD, you have this Muratorian who made this canon of inspired New Testament books. And he gave a list. And it's interesting, go back and look this up if you want to in your own time, to see, you have people argue about different books should be in the Bible and why don't we have this, why don't we have that. Well, one of the ways we combat that is going to these old canons that were at the time of the early church. And we see that in these canons, the New Testament we have is basically the same. A matter of fact, the only thing that's different in the Muratorian canon versus our canon, our New Testament day, is the book of Hebrews. And Muratorian doubted it because of the lack of an author. And later others come back and say, no, it proved to be true. And so this is just some things that we can learn. And again, these are lists of books that should be included in the New Testament. And in this list, he lists Luke as the author of Acts. There's also another man by the name of Clement of Alexandria. He wrote during this time of AD 150 to 217. Then there's Tertullian, who lived from AD 150 to AD 220, who again, all these people attributed attributed Acts to Luke. They said Luke is the one who wrote these books. And so the external evidence points to Luke as the author. Now again, we look at that and we can say, okay, these men say it, but is there proof to it? Because again, just because they say it, they're not inspired, they're not biblical writers, that doesn't mean we have to believe it. Because there are some things that these people write that are later proved not to be true. So we have to ask, is there anything else that points to Luke as the author? The other thing we have in Luke is the internal evidence. And what's interesting about the internal evidence is that there is internal evidence within the book of Acts itself that points to the author of Luke. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this before. As you've read the book of Acts, if you've ever noticed the we passages. If you got your Bible, let's look at one of these passages. Let's go to Acts 16. Turn your Bible to Acts 16. And as you read Acts in one setting, I want you to pay attention to the subtle shifts here. All right, if you're in Acts 16, look at verse 6. We start at verse 6. It says, and they went through the region of Phrygia. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you, I'm reading from the English Standard, so if it's different than yours. For the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come up to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. Now, notice them, they. He continues in verse 8, verse 9. But notice the change in verse 10. In verse 10, and when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia. And what happens is for the next 5 or 6 verses, there is the mention of we or us. This goes all the way down to verse 17. And you continue on to this. And what's interesting is after Acts 16, this is going to be the Philippian jailer. When you get to Acts 17, verse 1, you notice he shifts back to they. So what we can conclude here is these we passages happen when the author of Acts joins Paul. He joins in to help Paul, to be with Paul in his missionary trips, but as Paul typically did, when Paul got ran out of a town, Paul would leave some of his co-workers behind. And he would leave them behind to carry on the work of the church as he continued forward teaching and preaching the gospel in a new place. And so what we see is we can look then at these we passages. And we'll notice this is Acts 16, Acts 20, when Paul's headed to Caesarea, to Jerusalem, Acts 21, and then Acts 27 through verse 28. I apologize. That's not supposed to be an L. That's supposed to be about, I don't know what that's supposed to be. Probably verse 2. But anyway, in Acts 27, he'll talk about the we passages. And the Acts 27, I bring this up because these are the key passages to help us identify Luke. Because what we can do, and again, for the sake of time, we don't have all that time to dig into this, and because this is very interesting study. You can do this on your own if you want to. You can study who was with Paul. And if you look at Acts 27 to 28, that's Paul in Rome. This is when Paul writes the books of Colossians, Philippians, Philemon, and Paul will tell the people who are with him. And what we can do is we can take the list and say, okay, here's the people Paul lists who are with him. And then we can go to the book of Acts and look and say, okay, where were these guys mentioned? Because we're going to find out that John Mark is with Paul when he's in Rome. Well, John Mark is called by name. So if John Mark is called by name, that means he's not we. So we take him off. And we basically can deduce, and we get it down to, if we have all the names, we get it down to 2 or 3 men that are listed as being with Paul, who are never listed by name in the book of Acts. Because Luke is one of these men who's never listed by name. And so we assume him to be we. And so this is how some people have deduced that Luke is the author of these 2 books. And we'll talk about in a minute. There's another reason I think it's just as powerful as this. And so we can deduce and figure out that Luke is the one who is listed as being with Paul, but he's not mentioned by name in the book of Acts. Any question about that? Do you understand what I'm talking about here with the we and drawing those lists? You can go back and study. Truth for Today doesn't do it, but I think he tells you to check out J.W. McGarvey and I forgot his name. The other guy's an Allen. Jimmy Allen. He does a book on Acts that he dives into this discussion if you want to know more about it. And again, your church library probably has this. And you can find it online looking at the we passages of Acts. But there is other internal evidence that points to someone writing the book of Luke and Acts that is of a medical persuasion, if you will. That this is the one that's always been the most interesting to me when I found this out. When you look at Luke, Matthew, and Mark, and again, when you look at Luke, or Acts, you say, well, why are we bringing Luke in? Well, Luke and Acts have the same introduction, the same author. So they have to agree. Whatever we can say about Luke, we have to say about Acts. What happens in Luke is, this is a very famous passage to us. Matthew 19:24, Mark 10:15, and Luke 18:25. In English, all say the same thing. That's talking about the rich man. It's easier for the camel to enter the eye of the needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom. We know that verse, right? Did you know that the word for needle is different in Luke than it is in Matthew and Mark? In Matthew and Mark, they use a Greek word called rhaphis, which is a common household needle. Luke uses the word ballonné, which they think is a surgical needle. And if it's a surgical needle that was used like today to do stitches, if that word is used, then that would point to the author of Luke being somebody that has a medical background. And we know from Colossians 4:14 that Luke is the beloved physician. And therefore, that is to me one of the more combined with the we elements, points very favorably to Luke being the author. In that when he talks about the needle, and again, this is the idea of, you see the personality of the authors in the biblical books coming through, in that they both have the same point, but the different word is used. Matthew and Mark use the common word for needle, what we would call needle, whereas Luke uses the surgical needle. And so this points to, again, Luke being this medical field. And so the internal evidence points toward Luke, and the external points toward Luke being the author. Matter of fact, Luke hasn't been argued against of being the author of Luke and Acts until recent years, when people are trying to destroy any biblical history. So just be wary. If you see people argue against Luke, they're typically the ones who are arguing against any kind of biblical inspired writer. Matter of fact, some try to say that Acts wasn't written until the 2nd century, which doesn't make sense when people say it was the guys witnessed it in 150. But that's an argument for another time. Now, what do we know about Luke? This will help us understand the book of Acts as well. Number one, the first thing we know is that Luke was most likely a Gentile. And again, I say most likely because we make some assumptions here in looking at this passage, but I think it's a correct assumption. And let's go to Colossians chapter 4. Colossians chapter 4 and verses 10 through 14, Paul makes a statement. And in this statement, he doesn't say that Luke is a Gentile, but the context leads us to understand that. Now, here's the interesting thing. Colossians, and it's interesting here, Colossians is one of those books that was written while Paul was in Rome. So it's one of those books that tell us the people who are, and this is one of those sections that tell us the people who are with Paul at this time, that we can go back and say, okay, are they in the book of Acts, to deduce who the author is. If you look at verse 10, Paul begins to list these people who are with him. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you. Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justus. Now, notice the end of verse 11. These are the only men of the circumcision among my fellow workers for the kingdom of God, and they have been a comfort to me. So he says, these are the only Jews who are with me, the ones who are of the circumcision. And then notice in verse 11, he begins to talk about, verse 12, he talks about Epaphras. Then verse 13, continues verse 14, there's where he talks about Luke and Demas. And that leads us to connect some dots that Epaphras, Luke, and Demas were Gentiles who had converted over. And so this tells us a little more about Luke, that he was a Gentile. He wasn't a Jew. And there's some things he will write that lead us that way, in that when Luke, in Luke and Acts, describes a Jewish custom, he will explain it to us. And that's one way we can tell the purpose. And now, let me explain how this works. You look at Matthew. Matthew tells us something the Jews do, and he doesn't explain why they do it. Luke will tell us what they did and why they did it. It would sort of be like us. Say we were writing a book or writing a letter to someone, and we told them about how we celebrate Thanksgiving. We would just, if we're writing to a fellow American, we would just say we celebrate Thanksgiving and don't really describe it at all. But if we were to go to Mexico and witness how they celebrated the Day of the Dead, and we write back to some of our family back home trying to tell them about the Day of the Dead, we wouldn't do it like we do Thanksgiving. And at Thanksgiving, we would just say we celebrated Thanksgiving and keep going. We would say they celebrated the Day of the Dead, and here's how they did it. Because we would want our family to know, okay, here's what this is about. Luke does this with Jewish customs. He'll say, hey, this is what the Jewish custom was about. That tells us who Luke was, and it also tells us who he's writing to. And we'll get more into that in just a few minutes as well. But this is the idea of who we know that wrote the book, or who we can assume. All right, any question about that? Again, if y'all have any questions, just flag me down and we'll go from there. All right, now let's ask the question, when? When did Luke write this book? Most believe Luke wrote the book in 62 to 63 AD. That these 2 years would have been about the end of the 2 years mentioned in Luke 28 or Acts 28:30. And the reason we say that is because it seems odd that Luke would have not mentioned Nero. And it's during Nero's reign, the Roman Emperor Nero, that Paul is executed. Nero comes to power in 64 AD. We'll talk about him in just a minute. And it seems very odd that if Nero was in power, that Luke would have mentioned, but he doesn't mention Nero. However, there's no mention in some other dates that Luke should have dated. The other ones that are interesting here, the ones that point to this 63 AD or so writing, is that in the book of Acts, the Romans and Rome is portrayed in a positive light. The reason we know that's before 64 is because in 64 AD is when Rome burns. And that's a whole, again, I keep saying a whole other thing that you can be on your own, is in 64 AD, part of Rome, the slums of Rome, burn. Historians believe that Nero was the one who burned Rome, but there's no real proof. So what happens here is Nero looks for a fall guy. And again, you think our politicians are bad. There's nothing new they're doing that hadn't already been done. So Nero has to find a fall guy. Nero blames the Christians. Nero says the Christians are the ones who burned down Rome. And starting in 64 AD, Nero begins to persecute the Christians. This is where he begins the stories of him lighting his gardens with the Christians, binding them to stakes and burning them at night to light up his gardens, the putting them in the gladiatorial arenas and fighting lions and tigers. Those kind of things happen in 64. It seems very odd to me and to other writers, if Luke wrote after these events happened, why wouldn't he tell us about them? Why wouldn't he include these things to let us know? He's told us when Christians were persecuted before, so why wouldn't he tell us about what happens under Nero, unless the book of Acts is already finished before Nero comes into power? And that has led to this idea that the dating of the book to 62 or 63 before Nero. The other thing that happens is Acts 20, verses 25 and 38, when Paul goes sees the elders at Ephesus, in the book of Acts, there is the way they put it and the way they say it is that this is the last time Paul's going to see them. That Paul goes to see them because he doesn't think he's going to come back. He thinks he's headed to Rome to die. But what we find out, but what we actually find out later, and this is not outside, this is actually in the Bible itself, is that after his imprisonment in Rome, the first imprisonment, Paul is set free. And he goes back. And the idea from 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3, is when he leaves Rome, Paul goes back to Ephesus, where he leaves Timothy. And he tells Timothy to stay in Ephesus and help establish the church, get the elders going. And this is where he gives the qualification of elders. And so it seems odd that if Luke, like here, if Luke had written after Paul's death, which would have been in 64, then he wouldn't have said in Acts 20 that Paul said this was the last, or Paul thought this was the last time he would have seen him. It would have had something of the effect of he thought it was the last time, but it wasn't, or he got to see them again, something to that effect. However, if he wrote before Paul got released, then Acts 20 makes sense of why he wrote like he did, because he didn't know what the future held. The other thing we can know, and this goes out a little further, is the idea that Luke at least wrote before 70 AD. 70 AD is when the temple is destroyed. Acts does not mention the temple. As much as it mentions the temple in the first few chapters of the church worshiping there, he would have included about the temple falling, but he doesn't. And so this leads us to Luke writing the book of Acts in 62 to 63 AD. And again, I know these are probably some dates you've never known about or thought about, but this is what I want you to see, to understand where we see Luke in history and where Luke fits. Now, the next question I'm going to ask is where? Actually, I think these are backwards. Let me go ahead and go this way. I don't know if you can read this. This is a timeline. This is from the book, the Truth for Today commentary. This gives us the idea of the timeline of when Paul was in these different places. The first Pentecost is AD 30. The dispersion of the Jews and the Jewish church is AD 33, AD 33, 34. That's Acts 8. That's Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. The conversion of Saul is 34. Saul escapes in AD 37. Evangelism outside of Jerusalem, conversion of Cornelius and such, is from 34 to 43. Most people think that Cornelius and the Gentile church is not converted until at least 5 to 10 years after the establishment of the church. That the first few years the church is stayed in Jerusalem, then it begins to spread out. Acts AD 44 is the death of James. That's Acts 12. And again, we look at the book of Acts, we don't see these dates, but you're looking from Pentecost to the death of James, that's 12 chapters, that's nearly 14 years. 13, 14 years past. And so this is where these kind of things are important. This is just some other things that happened. Galatians is thought to be written about 48, 49 AD, somewhere around 50. 1st, 2nd Thessalonians were written around 50. They're written from Corinth on Paul's second missionary journey. These little trivia, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are believed to be the first New Testament books written. The first books we have, they're believed to be the first two books that were written and circulated. From there, we begin to see the rest of these, and you notice this 50. It's here that Paul's arrested in Caesarea, 57 to 59. His first imprisonment from Rome, 60 to 62. Here's where he writes Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. And here's the thing that I want you to understand, and this is something that it took me a while until I got to school and started studying this to understand this, that the book of Acts ends here. Paul continues to live for 5 to 6 years after the end of the book of Acts. And I say that because typically we think the end of the book of Acts is the end of Paul. Paul actually continues to work after that. Paul is set free from prison, and after that, he goes through his trips, one we just talked about, where he writes to Timothy after leaving him at Ephesus from Macedonia. We go again to Acts 60, or AD 66, 67. Paul writes from Rome, and this is where he's going to be beheaded by Nero. And it's at this time that he writes 2 Timothy, which would have been the last book Paul wrote. That Paul wrote to Timothy, where he says, I'm being poured out, I'm being offered. That the time period has jumped from Paul being under arrest to being freed to now he's arrested again. And so this is the timeline. I'll give you this in the email and in the PowerPoint. This is an interesting thing to see. And what I want you to see with this is, again, not... number one, I don't want you to think that you got to know this on a quiz. I'm not going to say, okay, what happened in 60 AD? And you got to tell me. I just want you to see the timeline, because we sometimes get in our head the Bible timeline, or we may not even think about the Bible timeline. But this is a timeline of the book of Acts, of how it plays out and how these other books were written in the time of these, in the time of Acts, and where Paul was and who Paul was with. And so this is what we're looking at when we're talking about these ideas of history. And so this is why we say Paul was in prison 60-62 at the end of Acts, because he's set free from that imprisonment, But then later, he is arrested by Nero, and that's when he's finally put to death. Because sometimes as Christians, and just today, we read the book of Acts, we assume at the end of Acts that Paul's put to death. Well, it's not. It's actually about 5 or 6 years after the end of Acts that Paul is put to death. So that's just an assumption we sometimes make that is not as it should be. Now, as far as the next question of where did Luke write from? Luke and Acts were written most likely over an extended period of time in which Paul was in prison in Caesarea and Rome. We know this from the passages. Paul is in prison in Caesarea, which is a few miles outside Jerusalem. You remember your book of Acts, Acts 21. Paul goes to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. He's arrested. He is sent to prison. He appears before Felix, Festus, King Agrippa, and then he's sent to Rome. During that time period, from Acts 21 and following, is when Luke begins to write his gospel and write the book of Acts. And what happens here is we're going to see in Luke's introduction to both Luke and Acts, he speaks of getting witnesses, of interviewing people, and finding out the truth. And he writes to Theophilus, and we'll talk about who Theophilus is in a minute. But as he writes, he tells them that he has investigated the truths they've been taught to find out if they are truth or not. And he goes and finds out eyewitnesses. And so it makes sense that where he would find the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life in the early church would be in Jerusalem. Well, for 2 or 3 years, Paul is in prison in Caesarea. So it makes sense that while Luke's there, that's when he begins to gather his information about the early church, the life of Jesus, and he begins to put this together. Now, again, let me stress this idea here, that just because Luke interviews eyewitnesses and he gathers his fact, in no way diminishes his inspiration. Some people will look at that and say, well, that don't make sense. If he was inspired by the word, if he was inspired by the Spirit, then he didn't need eyewitnesses. And you're right, he didn't. But he did them. He got them. He used the eyewitness accounts to verify what happened, and he was inspired what to write. We know the Holy Spirit inspired him in what he wrote, and just because he used eyewitnesses' accounts does not in any way, shape, form, or fashion diminish that he did not, or he was not an inspired writer. He was an inspired writer. He just did his research to make sure what he had was true, and you're going to see in his introduction that he wants to make sure that he has all the facts. And again, that lines up again with the idea that he is a physician, a doctor, a learned person. All right, so that's where Luke wrote it from. Let's get to this. Let's look at this idea. What was his purpose? And this is, we're going to get into that, what we just talked about a minute ago, him using eyewitnesses. Brother Roper in his book, Truth for Today, gives about 4 or 5 purposes that Luke has. 4 or 5 purposes for why he wrote the book of Acts. And we're going to use those as here. Luke and Acts is unique in that they don't have a purpose statement. Certain books of the Bible give us their purpose statement. If you don't know this one. Not for a test, just for you. Did you know that John tells us why he wrote his Bible, or why he wrote his gospel? If you go to John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31, John says, I've recorded all these things that you may believe that this is he. And he tells us why he wrote. His entire book was to prove who Jesus was. There are other writers who will tell us why they wrote their book. Luke doesn't. So we have to ask, what is Luke's purpose? Well, we don't know. There have been theories all across the board of why Luke wrote what he did. Some people think that Luke wrote, and this is not one of these purposes, some people think that Luke wrote this book as a defense for Paul. Because remember, Acts AD 60, Acts 28, Paul is in prison in Rome. And so some people think he uses the book of Acts to say, well, here's this church you're accusing Paul of. And they'll say that, and we'll talk about this a little later, is that Luke will tell us about the church, and when he speaks of the Roman leaders, and we mentioned this point in passing earlier, when he speaks of the Roman leaders, they're always spoken of in a good light. And the church is spoken of in a good light in reference to the church, to the Roman officials. They're not trying to stop them. They're not trying to hinder them. They're actually working together. And I say working together, and they're not stopping them. They're not holding them back. So this is why we look at what Luke's for. But what can we know? Well, we can know a few things about Luke. Luke, in his 2 books, he has a historical purpose in what he did. Luke was a careful historian. In that, in his 2 books, he gives us over 100 different names. And he lists over 100 different places. He talks about Roman politics, laws, and local customs. Now, you may ask that and look at that question and say, okay, that's just him telling the story. What has that got? What importance is that? Here's where this is important as far as biblical proof and biblical evidence is. You've seen people, or if you pay attention, you'll see people today, they try to tear the Bible apart by saying the Bible is false because they'll try to disprove a person, place, or thing. They'll try to say this person's not real. Therefore, the Bible's made up because they made up this person. Or they'll say this place didn't exist. And the interesting thing is that so far, and I believe it'll be this for all time, every time history has tried to say the Bible is wrong about a person, place, or thing, archaeology has backed up the Bible. There have been times when, for years, over 100 years ago, the historians said there was no such thing as David. David was a made-up Bible character. Well, the last 100 years, they found inscriptions that talk about the house of David, the king of David. And so historians have had to go back and say, well, I guess David was a real person. And if David's a real person, then that verifies that the Bible was talking about a real person. So when Luke gives these careful things, he is setting, he doesn't know this, but it's setting up today for skeptics to try to prove him wrong. Because if they can prove one of these names, one of these places is wrong, then they can discredit the whole story of Acts. But because he named all these places and he was careful with these places, they were real places, they're verifiable places, his story has been backed up in history. And even the politics of the day, he'll talk about certain Roman politics. They have been proven to be true. He talks about the Roman laws as nationwide and also custom laws. Laws that the Jews would have had or different people have. And so Luke is very careful in his historian. He tells us these things are facts, and he wants us to know the things that are important to understand the story. Now, the other thing about him is that he's selective in his history. And when I say selective, meaning he doesn't tell us everything. And that's just typical. This is a statement I've made many times just from to me, this is how it sounds. And I think most people agree, is that if we were writing the book of Acts, or we were writing the Gospels, we would have wrote different than what the Gospel writers in Luke wrote. And here's what I mean. You think about it. Go back to the Gospel of Luke. If you were told to tell the story of Jesus, in our modern writing style, we would write a biography that said, day 1, year 1, we did this, 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 and this. Day 2, we did this, this, this. Day 3, we did it. We would give a more succinct, more complete thing of what happened day to day. And you look at the book of Acts, and you look at the book of Luke, they don't do that. The Gospels don't give us that kind of record. So day 1, we do this. Day 2, we did this. Matter of fact, you look at Matthew and Luke, they're not necessarily chronological. Matthew is put together for the purpose of teaching the Jews. Mark is the most believed to be the most chronological biography, if you will, of Jesus. Does that diminish them? No. It just showed their purpose. Luke with Acts, is selective. How do we know that? There are 12 apostles. 11, then Matthias is chosen, and Paul is added. But yet the book of Acts focuses on what? 2. It focuses on Peter for the first 10 chapters. And then from chapter 11 following, it focuses on Paul. What about John? What about James? What about Andrew? What about all these other things? Matter of fact, and I forgot to put this in the thing, the name Acts in some older Bibles is called the Acts of the Apostles. That name is, again, a little faulty, and it's not really the Acts of the Apostles, it's some of the Acts of some of the Apostles. Because even what Peter and Paul does is not concisely told. And again, we know that Because we look at the book of Galatians. Galatians will fill in some holes and tell us, hey, in Acts 9, the conversion of Saul, Acts 9, you read the conversion of Saul, then he has to flee from Damascus. In reading Acts, it sounds like that's just a matter of days. Well, you look at Galatians, that's actually a couple years in between Paul arriving in Damascus and Paul having to flee. And again, does that point to a fault? No, that wasn't Luke's purpose, to tell us the details. Luke wanted to tell us the main events. And they were not as concerned about time as we are. When we talk about something, if we talk about something happened, we want to know the date, the month, the year, all that detail. They didn't care about that. They just need to know the general idea of when this happened. And so this is why I say Luke was selective in his writing. The next thing we can learn about Luke is that he had a Christological purpose, meaning he focuses on Jesus. Luke 1, he's going to tell us that he's writing to tell us about the life of Jesus, all that Jesus taught, began to teach and do. Acts 1:1, he speaks of Luke being that, but Jesus began to teach and do. Acts 1:1 points to the fact that the book of Acts is a continuation of what Jesus did. That it's actually what Jesus continued to do and teach. Showing that Jesus, although he was crucified and had been resurrected, he was still a part, still active, still behaving in the world. And we can understand that because, again, from a human side, when you die, you're done. Well, this is another point that he was Christ, he was the Son of God, that he continued to work even after that purpose. And Luke Theophilus wants us to know that Jesus is still alive and well. Jesus is still working. He's still teaching. He also tells us that there was a missionary purpose. If you look, go back to your Bibles and go to Acts 1. And we'll look at these two verses. Acts 1:1 and then Acts 1 verse 2. We'll look at those two verses. Notice in the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day when he was taken up, after he had given commands through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. Again, the idea is that he began to do it and he continues to do it in verse 2 until the day when he was taken up after he had given commands, after he had given orders. Anybody take a guess at what those orders were?
Go into all the world.
Go into all the world, the Great Commission.
Yeah.
It is the continuation of that thing. And a matter of fact, if you do this, and here's something else I can tell you, when you read the book of Acts, if you got time, before you get into Acts, go back to Luke. You don't have to read the entire book of Luke. If you can, that's great. But look at the end of Luke 24. Read the end of Luke 24 and then jump right into Acts 1. And you will see a continuation of the story. Luke 24 speaks of Jesus' Great Commission in Luke, of telling them to go into all the world. It talks about what the apostles do. Then we begin to see them carry that out. And so Luke writes us to tell us about the missionary purpose, that they were following out the Great Commission. And therefore, the story of Acts continues that story of Christ and his followers carrying out those orders. And Luke and others carrying out those orders to carry the word and carry the word to all people. Now, the other thing about this, and there's two more purposes here that we're going to look at, and then we'll probably take a break for a few minutes, is what was his purpose? Why did Luke write this book? And we've been talking about this, sorry. Another one is the apologetic purpose. The word apologetic is not like us. When we talk about being apologetic, is somebody that says they're sorry, apologizing a lot. In Greek, the word apologetic means defense. Apologetic is a defense of what they're doing. And Luke writes this in an offense against Christianity. Because what happens is there began to be false rumors circulating around that the church was different things. There are some Roman historians who wrote in the first couple of centuries that accused the church of being cannibals. Did you know that? That the church was accused of being cannibalistic. And you know how they got that? From the Lord's Supper. Because what did they say? When you eat the Lord's Supper, you partake of his what? His body. When you take the bread, you take his body. So the Roman officials heard them talking about eating the body, And they accuse the church of being cannibalistic. And so and that's just one reference. This is what Luke writes to argue against and says, no, it's not like that. And the Jews try to say they're rebellious, they're doing this and that. And Luke's going to say, no, matter of fact, it's not. And a matter of fact, like I mentioned a minute ago, when Luke wrote in Acts, he reveals that in relation to the Roman government, the church walks hand in hand with it. It doesn't rebel against them. It doesn't fight against them. It's not the charge of the Jews. Remember, the charge of the Jews is, they don't want to follow the Romans. They don't want to follow Caesar because they've got their own God as king. They got their Christ as king. And they try to avert that. And Luke's like, no, they're not trying to rebel. Now, again, he doesn't say that Christ is not king, but he's wording it in a way that shows that they're in step with the law of the land. They're not going to go against the law of the land unless it violates the law of God. And we'll talk about that when we get into Acts. And so he presents the Christianity, the Christian life, the church, as something that is positive. And finally, Luke had a didactic purpose. And I'm using a big word there, didactic. Didactic means teaching. There's a book. It's what's called an apocryphal book. It's a book outside the inspired Word of God called the Didache, the teachings of the church. And Luke had a purpose to teach. He wanted to teach about the things that Jesus had taught, and he wanted to make sure that what they taught was true. Again, look with me one last verse, and we'll look at this verse and we'll take a break. Go to Luke chapter 1 and go to verse 4. In Luke's introduction there to Theophilus, and we're about to get into Theophilus in his introduction. But since he's writing to these two books are connected, we can see the same purpose. Luke chapter 1, verse 4. Notice the end of this. He says that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. That you can know what you taught were true. What you were taught were true. And he says that for the book of Luke. And he also continues to say that for the book of Acts. That Acts was a book of teaching. He wanted Theophilus to know that what he had heard about Christ, what he had heard about the church was truth, it was verifiable, and it was what he needed to know. And so that was his purpose. Next, we're going to talk about to whom Luke was written. But like I said, we've been going about an hour here, so I'm going to stop, give y'all a break, get up and stretch, run to the restroom. Anybody got a question about what we've talked about so far? All right. Yeah.
I'm confused about the temple. What temple? Where was it? Is this Solomon's temple?
Yeah, Solomon's temple was
Okay.
well. Actually, it's Solomon's temple that had been rebuilt by Herod. It's the same. It's
not
called
the original one.
No, it's not the original. The original one was destroyed by Babylon.
Right.
And when the Jews come back, they build a smaller version of it, and around the 1st century BC, before Christ, Herod the Great, we always think about the negative lot of him killing the babies. He actually built a temple that was second to Solomon's. And so it's his temple that's there. And I think I got a layout of what that temple would have been like. The temple at the time of Acts, from history measurements, they said you could fit 10 football fields inside of it. That's how large of a complex the temple was. Like I said, that blows our mind. For years, I always thought the temple was the size of a church building or something small. But historians have went back and looked at it, and they said that you could fit 10 football fields in that circumference. And we'll talk about that when we get to the Acts. But yeah, this is Herod's temple. I'm trying to think what happened. Yeah, the Jews rebuilt the temple in about when they come back from Babylon. And then Herod rebuilt it, made it stronger right before the time of Jesus. And it lasts until 70 AD when the Romans tear it down and it's never built up again. But this is on the same ground where Solomon's temple is, but Herod has built it at this time. And Herod does that, again, political move. The way to keep people happy is to build them a nice big complex for them to serve their God at. Herod was related to the Jews. He didn't really believe in God, but he built them a nice church building to satisfy the Jews and keep them quiet. And it still didn't work. But that's a whole nother discussion for another time. But yeah, we're talking about Herod's temple, and I'll show you the layout as we get into the book of Acts, because like I say, the temple is key, because the first church, that's where they meet most of the time. They met at the temple. And the reason they were able to do that, again, our minds, the temple is like a church building, and it's not that big. But if you've got this huge area, you've got all kind of places for people to meet. And we'll talk about that, and I'll show you a drawing of what the temple would have looked like and how it's laid out in just a minute. But yeah, like I say, as far as the temple, this is the one Herod would have built, that Jesus would have been in, and it had been there in Jerusalem itself. Any other question or comment? All right, let's take about a 5 or 10 minute break. Y'all can stretch and